Hello, and thank you for joining the Developmental Disabilities Council of Oklahoma's webinar on alternatives to guardianship. My name is Leanne Kingsbury, and I will be your facilitator. To begin, when we think about guardianship, when we think about the process of helping someone make decisions or supporting someone to make decisions, or recognizing perhaps that someone doesn't have the capability to make certain decisions in their life, we often think that our options are no guardianship or guardianship. We often see it as one or the other. And in fact, decision-making and authority for decision-making is a bit of a continuum. And on that continuum, we can think of one end as beginning with this notion of independence. It's a little bit of a false notion because most of us are not solely independent to the extent that we never include anyone else in our decision-making. Most people, particularly when faced with a difficult decision, a complicated decision, a worrisome decision, will engage other people. We will turn to our families, we will turn to our friends, we may turn to the internet, which is always a little questionable because you're not sure what you could find. You will find very helpful information at times, but you might also find incorrect or very frightening information. But the point is that very few of us are solely making decisions independently of anyone else other than ourselves. But we're going to use that as sort of our starting point. And then at the other end of that continuum is the most restrictive decision-making, which is guardianship. And we will also touch briefly on conservatorship, which is another option for supporting decision-making in the state of Oklahoma. And so if we think about this as a continuum, and if we recognize that most of us do not make decisions completely void of anyone else's input, then the next space or the next place for us to consider is what I've called collective decision-making. Now, to be fair, collective decision-making actually has its own definition, and it's much more about group decision-making. That's not what I'm talking about here. In this case, I'm talking about turning to, seeking guidance from, asking for input from family, friends, professionals, people that you trust. And while we might call that supported decision-making, and it certainly is a kind of supported decision-making, as you'll see, supported decision-making is its whole own thing. And it is, in some cases, very formalized and very structured. And so we will also have a chance to talk about that. And then continuing along that continuum, the next type of decision-making we encounter is power of attorney. And again, we will talk about each of these in depth. But one of the things that I want you to note and to really pay attention to is when we look at this continuum, independent, collective, supported decision-making, and powers of attorney are all in the space where the person who is making the decision or who is requesting support and assistance to make the decision, or the person who we know will need some support to make a decision. All of those types of decision-making are part of the continuum where the person remains in charge. At this stage of the decision-making process, whether somebody's making a decision independently, whether they are relying on family and friends in an informal collective manner, or a slightly more formal supported decision-making process, or if they have identified a power of attorney. In those four areas, the person is in charge. The person has made a decision about who can help them, who they would like to help them make a decision. And that's critical when we think about alternatives to guardianship, because as we move along this continuum, the person begins to lose control. And if we really want to support self-determination, if we want to support people to learn and grow in their lives, then we want to offer opportunities. We want to make sure that we reinforce opportunities for people to stay in charge of their lives as much as possible, wherever possible. As we continue along that continuum, the next space that we hit, the next process that we hit, is called surrogate decision-making. And surrogate decision-making is determined by the courts. It is enshrined in law. And it says, and this varies a bit from state to state, but what it does is it lays out a hierarchy such that, I'm going to go back for a moment, if the person particularly does not have a supported decision-making team, and if they have not identified a power of attorney for healthcare or for finances in particular, then the law says, here's the order in which other people in the person's life can and will be asked to make decisions for them. And so what that means is we've now crossed that line to the space where somebody else is making a decision, both for the person and also about who can make that decision for the person. And again, we'll talk about this more in depth as we get through each one of these options. After surrogate decision-making, as we get closer to guardianship, there's an option for limited guardianship. Guardianship is a court-directed process. It requires that someone approach the court, petition the court is the language, that someone approach the court, provide evidence why another person is unable to manage their affairs. And the court will then make a determination of competency, whether that person has the ability to manage those affairs or not. With limited guardianship, the court may say that the individual requires a guardian for only one specific kind of decision-making, finances, for example, or healthcare, for example, but it's not full guardianship over the person and their property. And then beyond limited guardianship, the court has the option to assign full guardianship. And that allows a guardian to make decisions for a person in almost all areas of their life. There are some responsibilities or some places that guardians cannot make decisions. Guardians do have responsibilities to the court. It's an ongoing relationship with the court. They have to file plans, they have to file reports. And so it isn't quite as simple as someone obtains guardianship and the process ends. There is this ongoing relationship with the court and reporting to the court what kind of decisions are being made, how an individual's finances are being spent, etc. And so you can see that there's this continuum for decisional authority. At one end, again, we have this sense of independence where somebody makes decisions completely on their own. Again, that's probably a little bit of a misnomer because most people tend to rely on other people, at least for some kinds of decisions in their lives. And as we move across that continuum until we hit that middle line, there are various options, which are alternatives to guardianship, but which still allow the person to be in charge, to maintain control over that process and over deciding who will help them make decisions or who might make decisions for them if at some point they become incapacitated. Once we cross that line, somebody else is in charge. Surrogate decision-making is a court-issued, enshrined in law process. That hierarchy is decided for the person. Limited guardianship means somebody else, a guardian, will have a decision-making authority over certain decisions in a person's life, And then guardianship and conservatorship mean much more authority for the guardian. It's worth noting that conservatorship in Oklahoma is specifically only for people who have physical disabilities, and it does require voluntary consent. So it requires that the person say, I'm okay with this. I do want someone to manage my property. Actually, it's really about belongings and finances and the estate. Again, we will talk some more about that. In Oklahoma, there are 3 kinds of guardianship. As I've mentioned, there's general, which is that kind of full guardianship, control, management of the person's property, and really themselves, what they do, where they go, how they participate in the world around them. Limited guardianship, control over certain aspects of the person's life, and that is decided by the court in that guardianship petition process. And then special guardianship. And you might see this in a situation where there is an emergency situation, the person is not capable in that moment of making a decision for themselves. They may not have a power of attorney established. There may not be anyone else available designated in the surrogate decision-making hierarchy to make a decision for them. And so the court may grant a special guardian, typically limited for about 30 days. So if we're going to think about alternatives to guardianship, we should also be giving consideration to why or why not guardianship. Why would somebody pursue a guardianship path, or why would they not? Guardianship may provide some level of protection for people, depending on the circumstances, depending on who is in the person's life or who is not in the person's life, depending on the person's gifts and talents and capabilities or challenges experienced by that person. Guardianship may provide some protection. Guardianship certainly may bring comfort to a family or another loved one. It may feel like a protective measure. It may provide a sense of safety. It may be something that the family has always agreed to do for the long term, and that is serve in that decision-making guardianship role for their loved one. It may be the only public option available. Again, if it's not necessarily an emergency, but if the person has no unpaid supports and services in their life, if they no longer have family around, if they really need significant support in making decisions on a regular basis, then there may be a public guardian assigned. And as we mentioned, it's possible that guardianship may address an emergency situation when it arises, and it may be short-lived if it's an emergency assignment. What's the flip side of this? Why not guardianship? We need to understand that guardianship is highly restrictive. It may really limit someone's opportunity to learn, to try new things, to experience failure in a safe way, as most of us do. Most human beings try things and they don't always work. And we learn from those experiences, though sometimes it takes more than one time to learn, correct? Guardianship may restrict more rights than intended. It may seem like the right decision at the time, but the guardian may discover that the rights that have been restricted for the person are much more than they anticipated. And undoing guardianship can be a challenge. It is certainly possible, but in and of itself, it is another process to go through. When someone's life is highly restricted, and if in fact those restrictions include who somebody can spend time with, where they can spend their time, how they engage in the community around them, we really risk isolation. And when someone is highly isolated, we further risk neglect and abuse and exploitation. So we want to be cautious about what restrictions are placed on somebody's life. Guardianship is not a panacea. It will not prevent someone from making a bad decision or making a scary decision. There are limitations to what a guardian can do. And if the guardian is not standing side by side the person, and that person decides to go forth and do something that is risky, it may happen anyway. What's critical in this is that we want to help the person learn about risk. We want to help the person experience the world around them, as we all do, but also have a way to be safe and have a safety net in those explorations. And the other reason why not is that if it's a protective measure, if it feels like guardianship is about protecting someone, or being in the position to make a healthcare decision for someone, or being in a position to manage someone's finances, there are less costly alternatives. We go back to supported decision making, we go back to powers of attorney. So that's also an opportunity to explore other options aside from guardianship, when what we're trying to do is really, again, help somebody learn, have support in managing their affairs, but not be fully in control. When guardianship is requested, when someone approaches the court, petitions the court for guardianship over another person, the court requires evidence. The court expects that the person who's requesting guardianship will demonstrate that the other person is unable to manage parts of their life or many parts of their life, and therefore needs a court-appointed guardian in order to take care of those parts of their life, or have support in making decisions about those parts of their life. Courts are looking at competency. Courts are considering whether someone is competent to take care of, to manage other parts of their life. In addition to competency, when we consider decision-making generally, and we consider whether someone is able to make certain decisions, what we're considering is capacity. And so competency and capacity are sort of two sides of the same coin to some degree, but we need to understand the difference between them and how they are used, and where the differences are between them and where they're aligned, and why that matters. So let's talk about competency and capacity. Competency is a legal determination. A court determines that someone is incompetent as an adult, is an incompetent adult, and needs a guardian for specific parts of their life. Frequently, those parts are related to finances, they are related to healthcare, they may be related to decision-making around relationships and where somebody lives and how they spend their time. It is a court-directed process, and again, someone who is considered in the eyes of the court to be incompetent is assigned a guardian. Capacity, on the other hand, is a clinical determination. It's a determination about someone's ability to understand that they have the authority to make a decision, the ability to compare or weigh the risks and benefits of the decision that's in front of them, the ability to understand what happens if I make this decision, what happens if I don't make this decision. Capacity is typically assessed by clinicians. It requires the ability of the person to somehow communicate their decision. You have to be very clear to say that the literature does not say the person must be able to talk. We know lots of people who don't use words as their method of communication, who are fully capable of making lots of decisions in their lives. And capacity is situation and time specific. And what that means is that somebody might have capacity for one decision, but not another. So some decisions are much simpler than others. Do I want peas or carrots? Do I want to wear red shoes or blue shoes? Those decisions are much simpler and typically much less complex than multi-step, multi-layered healthcare decisions. If someone has a new critical diagnosis, for example, and there are lots of decisions to be made. So competency is a legal determination. Capacity is a clinical determination. If you look at the literature, there are generally 4 components of capacity. And so the way that we know somebody has capacity is we look at these 4 areas. And remember, they are situation and time specific. So somebody might meet the criteria for capacity for a simple decision, but not for a complex decision today. But if there's time to help someone learn all the nuances, all the ins and outs of that complex decision, they might actually be able to develop capacity for that more complex decision. So the 4 components of capacity are authority. The person recognizes that they have the authority to make the decision. It's their decision to make. Appreciation, that the person appreciates, has some understanding of the risks of the decision and the benefits of the decision. Logic, rationale. The person can tell us with some logic and some rationale why they're making the decision they're making. Do they understand what happens if I say no to this particular decision? What happens if I choose to do this? What are the risks? What are the benefits? What happens in either case? And can I logically explain that? And that logic is very personal. So we might be looking for somebody to lay out for us in a very methodical way. First, I thought this, and then I thought this, and then I stepped here, and sort of step by step. And that may not be how the person makes decisions. So it's logic and rationale that is inclusive of the appreciation of the risks and benefits, but also is the decision that person is making, does it appear to be consistent with what we know about their goals and their values? Does it align with what we know about that person? And can the person communicate that decision in a clear and consistent manner? Again, the literature does not say that the person needs to be able to talk with words to communicate their decision, but are they consistent in what they're saying about that decision? Yes, I want to do this. Yes, it's absolutely what I'm telling you I want to do. Yes, it's what I know. I understand the risk I'm taking. I understand the benefits, and I want to go forward. And if this is someone, for example, who's using just yes-no communication, do we already know historically that this person is accurate with their yes-no communication? So 4 components of capacity: authority, appreciation, logic, and communication. Let's dive into those a little bit more. Authority is an understanding from the person's perspective that this decision is mine. I own this decision. I have the authority to make this decision. So think for a moment about people that you know who routinely rely on somebody else to guide their decision making. And so you're in a conversation with this person and you ask them if they want to do something, and they quickly turn and look to somebody else in the room. Maybe it's their sibling. They turn and look at their sister. And you gently guide the person back and say, I really want to hear from you. I want to know what you think about this. And again, that person turns and looks to their sister. If this is somebody who routinely relies, always, 100% of the time, on somebody else to make their decisions, then we know we have some work to do around authority. So when we ask somebody, when we engage with somebody around a decision, we have conversations with somebody about this decision, we want to make sure that that person understands that they really do get to make this decision. Now, if we go back to the conversation about the continuum, that doesn't mean that the person has to make this decision in a vacuum and completely by themselves. Again, most people don't do that. So in having that person or that person asking if they can engage somebody else or involve somebody else or involving their sister in the decision making is absolutely okay. We want to be clear that this person is making the decision they're making free of any coercion, that they're not being influenced unduly by someone else, and that the person truly feels like, I'm the person who makes this decision. The second component, appreciation. So this is an understanding, appreciation of the risks and benefits associated with this decision. So I want to take a hot air balloon ride, and that's what somebody says they want to do. And we have a conversation about, you've always told me you're afraid of heights. Balloons go up pretty high. There's going to be lots of open space around you. Do you understand that that's kind of a risk in this? Yep, I've got it. What are the benefits to the hot air balloon trip? Well, I get to go with my friends. I get to do something I've never done before. I can see, 5 miles across the county where I live, whatever that conversation might look like. Point being that the person appreciates that there's some risk, but potentially some benefits in this decision. When we start thinking about healthcare decisions, we also want to make sure that people understand that when they are agreeing to a healthcare procedure, that there may be risks associated with that procedure. Sometimes sometimes those risks are simple and sometimes they're not. So we want to make sure that people really understand what it is they are agreeing to. What is that? Do they appreciate that risk and and those benefits? We also want to make sure that when we think about appreciation, that the person understands what happens if I choose not to do this, or what happens if I do choose to do this. So if you think about a healthcare procedure, what happens if I choose not to do it? It may not be life-threatening. It may not be critical. It may be, something of very minor significance and not urgent. And so you can wait, or you can decide you want to move ahead with it. But you want to make sure the person understands what happens if I make this decision and I go forward. What happens if I don't make this decision? What comes with that? That's a decision in and of itself. If I say, no, I'm not going to do this, then what happens? So we have authority, appreciation, and then we have logic and rationale. And again, this is very aligned with what do we already know about what's important to this person? And is this decision they're making pretty aligned with what we know about the person? Now, to be fair, people make decisions all the time that seem inconsistent with what we know about them. People change their minds. So this is not, we have to be careful to make sure that we're not looking at this in sort of black and white, very rigid context. The hot air balloon example again, if somebody you support, somebody has always told you they are afraid of heights, you've been to places where there's been a very tall outdoor escalator, for example, or you've been in a multi-level mall, for example, where you can look down onto the other levels, and those heights really, really bother the person, and the person says, oh, I'm really, really afraid of heights. And now they're telling you they want to go hot air ballooning. Maybe they've just changed their mind. Maybe they really do want to give it a try. Maybe no one has really explained it. No one's really sat down and said, do you realize how high up you're going? Do you realize that typically you've told me you're afraid of heights, and that balloon's going to go pretty darn high, right? So are they making this decision using information in a way that seems logical and rational? If you query the person and you start diving into this, and what they continually tell you is, my uncle tells me I should do this. My uncle tells me it's the right thing to do. My uncle tells me this is what I want to do. Then again, you know right away that the person, one, might not fully understand that they have authority, but they're also not making that decision in a way that is free of undue influence. On the other hand, if this is somebody who always bounces things off of their uncle, then that conversation probably just requires further exploration, because perhaps they've approached their uncle, the person that they always rely on, to ask about the hot air balloon experience, and their uncle says, if you want to do it, let's figure it out, right? And it just requires further exploration. And following logic and rationale, the last component is communication. Communication in a way that is clear and consistent, that we can understand clearly what the person means, that they are not rapidly changing their mind. If you ask them today about the hot air balloon, yep, I want to do it. You ask them in the afternoon, yep, I told you earlier, I want to do it. You ask them tomorrow, yep, I want to do it. Consistent answer. Again, it's okay if somebody also changes their mind. Yeah, I know yesterday I said I wanted to do that, but I've thought a lot about it and I'm not sure. That just means we wait. If you feel like the person has authority, they appreciate the risks and benefits, they've been making decisions in what for them is a logical and rational fashion, and now they change their mind, that doesn't mean they don't have capacity. It means they changed their mind. And it just requires us to wait, perhaps explore further. Free of coercion is a very important piece of this. Asking for input, asking for someone's opinion is absolutely ordinary. Having somebody feel like they've been talked into something that they don't want to do is coercive. So we want to be clear that getting lots of input, seeking others' thoughts and guidance is absolutely okay. But we want to feel certain that the person understands that they have the authority to make a decision, or to say, no, I'm not going to make this decision. I'm not going to do something. And can the person communicate that decision in a way that others can understand it? It may be yes/no communication. It may be by using some kind of communication device. It might be using a communication board. It may be using sign language. It does not have to be standard talking speech, okay? But the person does need to be able to communicate that decision that they're making. So there are the 4 components of capacity. Remember that capacity is situation and time specific. So if you don't feel that somebody has authority, an understanding of their authority for a decision today, and it's not an urgent decision, we'll talk in a few minutes about urgency and significance, but if the person doesn't quite meet the criteria you feel like, and the decision is not urgent, then you have time. Then you have time to help this person become more informed and make a decision with capacity for that decision, given that you have time to help them learn all of the parts and pieces. If it's an emergency decision and the person doesn't have capacity, then we need to think about who can make that decision for them. And we'll talk about that when we get to supported decision-making and powers of attorney. All right, I'm going to ask you to take a break for a minute. And I'd like you just to think for a little bit about how you make decisions in your life. What are the decisions that you make on a regular basis? Do I put sugar in my coffee? Do I want tea instead of coffee? Do I want to wear the red shoes or the blue shoes? What are those decisions you make every day on a regular basis? And how do other people in your life help you make those decisions if you need some help? What are some of the big decisions you've made? And has anybody questioned your ability to make a decision? And if so, how did you handle that? give some thought to that. That all ties in with our competency and capacity conversations. And we're going to explore urgency and significance next. So up to this point, we have considered this continuum of authority for decision making. At one end, we have independent or collective, where somebody is making their own decisions, possibly involving some family and friends to help them. At the other end of that spectrum, we have a situation where somebody else, a system or a person, has been put in charge and is making decisions for the person. We've looked at the role of competency as a legal directive, and we've looked at capacity as a clinical determination, and the components of capacity and somebody's ability or capacity, capability to make a decision. We also have to consider, when we think about alternatives to guardianship, why and how we might avoid heading all the way to the end of that continuum. We have to consider what types of decisions a person is capable of making. And we have to consider whether decisions are significant to the person. That's very personal. It matters a lot to me. It's very significant to me. And or whether it's urgent. Is it urgent from a clinical standpoint? Is it urgent from a systemic standpoint? Is it a healthcare decision that must be made urgently? Is it a systems decision or a systems of your life decision? For example, if someone's about to be evicted, we have to make a decision right now about where they're going to live. And is the person, again, capable of making that decision or not? So significance and urgency and capacity are all woven together here. And what we want to look at is really 4 areas. Is a decision not very urgent and also not terribly important to the person? Is a decision very important to the person, but it's not clinically or systemically urgent? Is it not very important to the person, but it's pretty urgent? It doesn't matter a whole lot to the person, but it could make a big difference in their life. Or in fact, does the person tell you it feels very important to them and it is urgent as well? And there are some action steps in each of those categories that we want to look at. So let's start with, what if a decision is not very significant to the person? It doesn't seem to matter a whole lot to them, and it's not terribly urgent. It's not a life-altering decision that will have health or financial implications if we don't make it right away. If that's the situation, but it is something the person is interested in, then we have time, and we should develop an action plan, evaluate whether the person has the capacity to make that decision that's at hand. Do they understand that they have the authority? Do they appreciate the risks and benefits? Can they think through in kind of some logical and rational fashion, explain why they would or would not make that decision? Can they communicate that decision right now? If it's not urgent, it's situation, capacity, remember, is situation and time specific. The decision is not urgent. The person might not need to have capacity right now to make that decision. But if that decision were to become urgent, or if it were to gain significance to the person, it becomes more important to the person. They will need capacity. So because it's neither significant or urgent right now, we have time. We have time to develop an action plan. We have time to put together a process for the person to develop capacity to make that decision, to see whether they can make that decision, particularly if capacity for that decision is not present right now. What happens if it is highly significant to the person? The decision at hand really matters to the person. It's not terribly urgent. Again, it's not going to be life-altering at this point in time if we don't make a decision about it. But the person wants to. They really care about it. This matters to them. Then we're still in that space of possibly having time because it's not urgent, But there should be some urgency attributed to it matters to the person. We don't want to ignore that. We can't brush it aside. It matters to the person. And so we ought to be evaluating the person's capacity to make that decision. And again, putting in place an action plan for do you have capacity to make this decision? If so, what's our process for getting there? When you're saying this is urgent, when do you want to do it? Let's move ahead with it. We evaluate capacity for the decision. We don't feel confident that the person is quite there, and we say, let's put an action plan in place so that you become fully informed about this decision because it does matter to you. And we will then move forward with the process for you to make this decision. What if the decision that's in front of us is very urgent? It has potentially life affecting properties. The decision could have a real impact on the person's health. It could have a real impact on their relationships. It could have a real impact on their finances. It's a pretty urgent decision. It's not emergency, but we need to pay attention to it now. What if that's the situation, but in fact, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to the person, or they tell us that it doesn't matter. The fact that something would be that urgent and may have significant implications for somebody's life, and that person says, doesn't matter to me, should for us be cause for us to stop and say, I wonder whether this person fully understands the implications of this decision. They're saying that they don't care, it's not that important to them, and yet the risks and benefits are significant. The risks and benefits are big. So we need to really make sure that the person understands the risks and the benefits and the implications. So if something is urgent, it's a pressing decision that needs to be made, either clinically or relative to someone's life, and that person seems indifferent, we ought to be exploring capacity. What does that person understand about that decision and that situation? What does that person understand about what could happen if they don't make a decision? What do they understand about what could happen if they do make a decision? So that's our exploration of capacity in that situation. And it may require a substitute decision maker. This may be the first time that we say it's an urgent decision and the person seems unable to make the decision or seems unable to understand the implications of the decision. Do we need somebody else who can make this decision? And that will eventually lead us to supported decision making or powers of attorney, and we'll be discussing that shortly. And then there is the meeting of it matters tremendously to the person and it's really urgent. And in this case, we are going to make some assumption that there may not be a lot of time to make this decision. There might be some, but again, this is not emergency, but it's urgent. So the first question has to be, how much time do we have to make this decision? Can we take a couple of days? Do we have a few hours? Or is it something that we really have to decide, here and now? That would almost be more emergency than urgent. But that question, when you are faced with, there's an urgent decision in front of us, and it matters a lot to the person, we should be asking right away, how much time do we have to make this decision? Because that will tell us, or will give us more information about, do we have time to help the person develop capacity? Do we have time to help this person understand their role in this decision, understand the risks and benefits and the consequences of those risks and benefits? And can we help the person develop a way to communicate that decision in a way that is aligned with their goals and their values for their life? So we have to ask that question, how much time? We have to consider, does the person have capacity for this decision? And if the urgency is increasing, if this is a situation where the person is really at risk of being harmed in some way, then we have to pretty quickly figure out if the person can't make the decision in the time that we have, if they can't develop capacity in the time that we have, who will make that decision for the person? So when we look at significance and urgency, we have, and they may overlap a bit, but we have kind of these 4 opportunities to consider how significant a decision is, how much does it matter to the person, and how urgent is it? What's the impact on somebody's life? If it's not very significant and it's not urgent, there's an assumption that we have some time and we can develop a plan. How are we going to know? How will the person know when it is time? What will the indicator be for them that, okay, I'm ready to make this decision, and are they capable? If it is very significant to the person, it really matters, and it's really something we want to do, it's not urgent. There's no significant life implication here. Then again, we have time, and we ought to start working on it right away because it matters to the person. We could be in the place where it is very urgent. It is significant. This decision could have life implications for the person, but they may be indifferent, or it may not matter a whole lot to them. That should tell us that perhaps the person doesn't quite understand the implications of the decision. And so part of our question ought to be, how much time do we have? Because we'd like to help, we want to make sure the person is more informed. We want to make sure that, we all think this is a pretty big deal. They don't seem to think it's a big deal. So let's make sure that we understand fully where they are coming from, and they understand fully the risks and benefits associated with this decision. And lastly, that intersection of where a decision is very urgent and it matters to the person, and we need to act quickly. And in that case, we need to be very clear and figure out, how much time do we have to make this decision? Is there time for the person to become informed and develop capacity for the decision if they don't have it right now? And what happens if it becomes an absolute pressing decision that really could impact the person's life quickly if we don't make a decision about it, and that person doesn't have capacity? Who will make that decision instead? So think about these intersections. We've sort of layered all of this, and that is one of the challenges in thinking about alternatives to guardianship. We can simply say, oh, we're just going to support the person to make decisions. But when we think about decision making, look at the layers that we are encountering. We have questions about capacity. We have questions possibly about competency. We have questions about urgency. We have questions about significance. There's multiple layers here. So some of the key takeaways, kind of understanding the intersections in this, are, first of all, everybody makes decisions. So if you hear somebody say, well, she doesn't make any decisions in her life, we should question that. With few exceptions, everybody makes decisions. Those decisions may be simple. They may be, I like carrots, I don't want peas. They may be, I like shoes that tie versus shoes that slip on. They may be, I want my hair pulled back in a ponytail, or I want to wear my hair down. I want sweatpants versus blue jeans. They may be relatively simple decisions, but they are decisions nonetheless. There are also more complex decisions where people might need more support. Reminder that capacity is about the decision that we're trying to make right now. Does the person meet the criteria for capacity for this decision right here, right now? And if the answer to that is no, then the question becomes, do we have time to help the person become more informed and develop capacity? We can't assume because somebody doesn't understand their authority or doesn't understand the risks and benefits today about this decision that they're being asked to make. We can't assume that they won't understand that tomorrow or the next day or next week. So we need to know how much time we have. Do we have time to help somebody become informed in making that decision? Consider the situation when you're faced with somebody questioning someone's capacity. Capacity is often a clinical decision. There was some research done with clinicians back in 2004 that determined a set of 10 myths of capacity. And one of the myths that came out of the research with clinicians around the country was that having a cognitive impairment was equal to lack of capacity. We know that that's not true. We know that people who live with some kind of a cognitive diagnosis, be that an intellectual disability, somebody who has an acquired brain injury, someone who has had a stroke, someone who's living with dementia, we know that those diagnoses do not necessarily automatically mean blanket does not have capacity for decision making. Capacity is situation and time specific. So when faced with a situation where the person's capacity is questioned, always ask the question, does this decision need to be made right now? Now, it's very possible the answer will be yes. This may be urgent enough that we have to make this decision right now. And if the person does not have capacity to make that decision at that moment, or if the person's capacity is questioned and you don't have time to advocate for the person's ability to make the decision, then that's one of the reasons we want alternative decision makers. We want decision makers identified ahead of time so that if for some reason the person cannot make the decision, they are incapacitated for some reason, or it's an urgent situation and somebody else is questioning the person's ability, capacity to make that decision, and we don't have time to advocate, then we want to make sure that there is a backup plan in place, and we'll talk about that. If we don't have to make the decision right now and we have time, then we need to put a plan together. How can we develop a plan for pulling all the information together, sharing that information with the person, helping that person become informed, walking them through the scenarios of the risks and benefits, and helping them learn about what happens if you make this decision, what happens if you don't make this decision, what are the implications of those decisions, how would you tell somebody about that decision? If the decision is urgent, at minimum, if possible, if the person is not completely incapacitated due, for example, to some kind of an injury or a medical event, then we should be engaging the person in helping to determine who will make this decision with you, who will support you in making this decision, or who can make this decision for you, if the person, again, can contribute to that conversation. Okay, we are going to take a quick break. Again, I'm going to give you a chance to think for a minute and stop and stand up and take a break. And as we go to break, I'd like you to think about another question. What kinds of decisions have you made? Think about the decisions that you have made, particularly complex decisions. And what was the process that you went through to make that decision, particularly if that decision was very important to you, but you didn't feel like it really mattered a lot to other people, or perhaps other people didn't realize how important it was to you. Did you just move ahead with that decision? Did you find it necessary to have more than one conversation? Did you find yourself reaching out to multiple people to have that conversation? And what kind of help did others provide? What did you find was useful and helpful for you? Also, give some consideration to, have you ever had to make a decision where you really felt like you needed more time or you needed more information? And what happened? What would happen? How do you think you might respond if time wasn't really an option? If you had to make a quick decision, really a big decision right then and there. Give that some thought. We'll take a break and we'll be back in just a few minutes. Okay, we have now covered competency and capacity. We've looked at significance and urgency. And we want to connect those now to the continuum that we talked about early on. We're going to start on the left-hand side of this continuum, where the person is in charge of who will help them make decisions. So we want to think about this through a lens of self-determination, of autonomy, where the person is in charge of their decision-making, or they're in charge of deciding who will help them with decision-making. I'm going to start with collective. Again, as I said earlier, independent is a little bit of a misnomer because very few people make solely independent, kind of in a vacuum decisions without engaging other people. But we're going to use that as kind of our starting point, and then really think about collective decision making, which is what most of us do when a big decision is in front of us, and we ask family and friends and others to join us in that decision. So collective decision making. Now, by definition, collective decision making is actually about group decision making. So I just want to clarify that that's not the definition we are using here. What we're really talking about is a kind of supported decision making. That's actually the language that the literature uses. But in disability services, supported decision making is its own thing, and we're going to get to that next. So using the language of collective was intended to just not confuse exactly what we were talking about. Collective decision making really is the process that most people use when they're making decisions. It is about engaging others, loved ones, family, friends, neighbors, professionals, to gather information, to give us input, sometimes to offer advice, sometimes to kind of bounce things off of, sometimes to hear stories, sometimes to ask, what's been your experience with this? But it is a way that many of us make complex decisions. Engaging other people in your decision making, supporting somebody with a disability to engage other people in decision making, does not mean the person is not capable of making a decision. When you think about the definition of capacity, you have that understanding of authority, right? That I have the authority to make the decision. And I appreciate the risks and benefits and the what happens if I do and the what happens if I don't. Well, how do you gather that information? How do you understand the risks and benefits? You might look at literature. If this is a healthcare decision, you might talk to your physician. If this is a financial or family decision, you might talk to a loved one. That gathering of information is what allows you to fully appreciate the risks and the benefits. What have other people's experiences been? So watching somebody engage others in a decision-making process is both ordinary and what we would expect anybody to do when it's a pretty complex decision to be made. So that's that collective decision-making. In collective decision-making, obviously the person is in charge of who they are involving in that decisional process. Now, they might also ask a friend, for example, or a family member, who else should we involve? But the person is still in charge of this process. Supported decision-making as a process, a defined process in the disability system, is really gaining momentum across the country for being recognized as an alternative to guardianship. And in supported decision-making, informal supported decision-making, there is some process that is laid out. It often involves supported decision-making agreements where people come together, chosen by the person. So the person is self-appointing or self-choosing their supported decision-making team. People come together around a person and they decide, I'll help the person with financial decisions. I'll help the person with healthcare decisions. I'll help the person with living decisions, where they live or how they live or things like that. And these are conversations and decisions and agreements among and between the person who lives with a disability and people that they've chosen to be part of that process and that team. Again, some states ask that very particular forms and agreements be completed. And in some states, if an individual approaches the court and requests guardianship, the individual requesting guardianship must demonstrate that they've already tried a supported decision-making agreement. That's in place in a couple of states. So supported decision-making is a little bit of a new process. We've seen it really kind of rising to the surface and gaining traction around the country over probably the past decade or so. And in April of 2021, Oklahoma recognized supported decision-making as one of the less restrictive alternatives to guardianship. It brings a group of people together. It still means that the person's in charge. They are choosing who those people are. Those people are deciding with the person what decisions they will help with and what that looks like and how that process will play out. When we talk about healthcare decision-making, there's a very formal process. The person is still in charge here. When we think about that continuum, this is still on the left-hand side of that continuum. We talk about healthcare power of attorney, and we're talking about a person saying, I choose you, can be anybody, I choose you to help me make healthcare decisions if I am unable to. And I said it can be anybody, and that's not exactly true. Powers of attorney cannot be anybody who will benefit financially from any healthcare decisions that are made. They cannot be an employee of your healthcare provider. And though community-based services are often not seen as healthcare, in the spirit of healthcare decision-making and powers of attorney, home and community-based service providers are considered healthcare providers. So your power of attorney cannot be somebody who is employed by your provider of services. The healthcare power of attorney is designated in Oklahoma by the Healthcare Agent Act. A healthcare power of attorney is a kind of advance directive. Advance directives most often, a complete or fully completed advance directive is typically an identification of a naming of the person's wishes about their healthcare, often called a living will, combined with designation of the power of attorney, somebody, a person who can honor those wishes, can ensure to the best of their ability that those wishes are carried out. A living will and a healthcare power of attorney individually, from a technical standpoint, they are both advance directives. They both are making directives in advance of need. But if someone has only identified their wishes and not designated somebody to carry those out, then you have designation of wishes without any authority for making sure those wishes are honored. So you really, really want to combine the living will and the healthcare power of attorney. And in fact, Oklahoma's healthcare power of attorney or advanced directive form, Oklahoma's advanced directive form contains both elements. It contains space for someone to identify their wishes, often called living will, and a space for identifying healthcare power of attorney and a backup healthcare power of attorney, which is also important. If you designate someone to be your power of attorney, your healthcare power of attorney, to make healthcare decisions for you when you are not able to do so, it's really a good idea to have a backup person. What happens if, by chance, there's a healthcare decision to be made, you've been seriously injured, you're not capable of making that decision, and the first person that you have listed in your advance directive isn't available? They can't be reached. You want a successor. You want a second person as another backup mechanism. To name your healthcare power of attorney, you must have capacity to do so. Now, go back to the capacity definition for a moment. The good news here is that the standard for naming your healthcare power of attorney is much less complicated than the standard for having capacity to consent for a very complicated healthcare procedure. The 4 components still apply. Do you have the authority? Do you understand that you have the authority to say, I want this person to help me make healthcare decisions? Do you understand that the benefit of that is that if you can't make your own decision, you've chosen a trusted person? Do you understand the risk that you are choosing somebody to act on your behalf? Power of attorney is only active when the person can no longer, at that moment, make their own healthcare decisions. So power of attorney doesn't go into effect the moment it's signed. It goes into effect when the person is no longer able, is considered incapacitated in that moment, and they are considered incapacitated to make their own healthcare decision. So you must have capacity to name your healthcare power of attorney. For many people, the complexity of that decision is much easier than walking through all of the potential risks and benefits of a very complex healthcare decision. It's much easier for some folks to say, I trust my sister to help me. My sister's always helped me. If I can't make a decision, I'm going to rely on her to do it. She knows me well, she knows what I want. I'm going to rely on her to do it for me. There are some decisions that powers of attorney can and cannot make. By Oklahoma statute, a healthcare power of attorney can make any decision the person could have made while they were capable, while they had capacity, while they were capable, other than the withholding or withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, nutrition, or hydration. So the person that you designate as your healthcare power of attorney may not end life-sustaining, may not withdraw life-sustaining treatment, including ending nutrition and hydration, unless you have noted that in your living will. And this really speaks to why you want both documents and why in the Oklahoma Healthcare Act, those 2 documents are put together. Those 2 pieces of one document, those 2 pieces of the advance directive go together, your living will and your healthcare power of attorney. And a valid healthcare power of attorney must be signed in front of 2 disinterested witnesses. So those witnesses should not be anyone who has any interest or could benefit in any way from a healthcare decision that may be made for you. So that's a healthcare power of attorney. it is possible that someone would have a financial power of attorney. Often people have both, but you don't have to. All of these are very personal decisions. A financial power of attorney, which is sometimes called a property power of attorney. If you're looking at old literature, if you're looking at old documents, you might also see it called a business affairs power of attorney. That's pretty old language. But this is a designation by the person to say, I trust you, naming somebody, to be my financial power of attorney. And that is to manage my finances, my estate, my assets, my property, if I am incapacitated, if I am unable to do so. And like healthcare power of attorney, a financial power of attorney does not go into effect until the person who has executed that power of attorney, until the person who said, here's what I want you to do, and then has that document notarized, does not go into effect until that person is incapacitated for some reason. When we talk about incapacity relative to the healthcare power of attorney and the financial power of attorney, it's important to note that we may disagree with this. In fact, we often disagree with this. The healthcare system, medical systems, may not be as up to date about the abilities of people who live with intellectual or developmental disabilities. We have probably all heard stories of someone being told by a clinician that the clinician doesn't believe the person is capable of making that decision, or simply sitting in a doctor's office and having the physician talk to the staff person or the parent or whomever is accompanying, if somebody is accompanying the person, and clearly not having this conversation with the person with disabilities. In my experience, it is not terribly uncommon that somebody needs healthcare and they would be very capable of making the decision that's in front of them. But the medical team challenges their capacity. While we may disagree with that, this is one reason why having a financial power of attorney or a healthcare power of attorney in place makes a lot of sense. There are times when somebody may challenge a person's capabilities to make a decision on their own, or even have support in making that decision. And you may have plenty of time to advocate for the person and really help the other people involved understand that this person with disabilities absolutely is capable of making their own decisions. But if you don't have time and you need a backup decision maker in place, you don't want to try to do this at the 11th hour, particularly if it's a harmful situation. You're talking about someone who has been exploited, someone who is financially at risk, or someone who is critically ill. You don't want to try to figure out who will make that healthcare or that financial decision for the person under that level of stress and worry and concern. So it's a really good reason to have a healthcare power of attorney put in place well before you need it. And it gives you time to have those conversations. This is not necessarily a simple conversation. It really gives the person time to understand why it might be necessary, how it would be used, when or when not it would be used, and the same with a financial power of attorney. So really options you want to try to get in place well ahead of time before they're actually needed. And you want to review them with some regularity. People change their minds. People make decisions about who they want to have involved in their life. And things happen. Relationships change, people move, So you want to make sure that you identify powers of attorney before you need them, and you review them with some consistency to make sure that it's still really, really the decision that the person wants. So what happens if there is a decision to be made, and it's an urgent decision, and it needs to be made right now? Let's consider this a healthcare situation. There's a critical healthcare decision to be made. We have a little window of time, but not a lot, maybe a few hours. And there is, the person is not capable at this moment. Assume for a moment that they are heavily sedated. Perhaps they're unconscious. They've sustained some kind of an injury. And they're not capable of consenting to whatever treatment is necessary and making the decisions that need to be made that come next to address this healthcare situation. And if that person has not identified a healthcare power of attorney, or if that person doesn't have a guardian, who will make that decision for the person? A majority of states have, in statute, in law, a hierarchy of who will make a healthcare decision for someone if the person is not capable of doing so. In Oklahoma, that hierarchy looks like this. And this is called surrogate decision making. And if we go back to that continuum that I shared with you, we've now crossed into the space where somebody else is making a decision for the person. And the person hasn't chosen them. So with surrogate decision making, when a person is incapacitated, they can't now they don't have capacity at the moment to make a decision. The decision needs to be made fairly quickly. And this person has not previously identified anyone who could make a decision for them. Oklahoma law says, we're going to check and see if you have a guardian. If you do not have a guardian, we're going to explore whether you have a healthcare power of attorney. If you do not have a guardian, if you do not have a power of attorney, we're going to see if you have a spouse. If you do not have a spouse, if you are not married, we're going to see if you have adult children. If you do not have adult children, we're going to see if your parents are still living. If you do not have adult children, if your parents are no longer able or available to make decisions for you, we're going to see if you have adult siblings. If you do not have siblings, we're going to now explore further and see what other relatives do you have in order of closest kinship to you. And if none of those people are involved in your life, we will check and see if there are any close friends who have maintained regular contact. This list is pretty consistent across most states. There are a few variables here and there, but generally speaking, it's pretty consistent. The good news is that if you have not, or a person has not identified a healthcare decision maker, a healthcare power of attorney, then we know who will be asked to make that decision for them. The law says if there are multiple adult children or multiple siblings, that a majority of that group must agree on the decision that's being presented or that's being asked. So the good news is we know who we can turn to make decisions for someone. The challenge here is that we've crossed into that space of the person no longer being in charge. And not just because they don't have capacity at the moment, but because they haven't previously chosen someone. And so now somebody will be chosen for them. And that person might be perfectly fine with their sibling making a healthcare decision for them, or a parent, or a cousin. But what if they're not? I used to provide services a long time ago to a gentleman who would have been very, very distraught over the knowledge that a sibling would make decisions for him. He had a healthcare power of attorney, thankfully, and sibling wasn't, that particular sibling that he was concerned about was not identified as his decision maker. But if he had not had a power of attorney, it was very possible, and a decision needed to be made, it's very possible that a sibling that he did not have a great relationship with and chose to not be actively involved with could have been asked to make his decision. So surrogate decision maker takes us across the plane into the space of somebody else is deciding for the individual who will make decisions. And then we have limited guardianship and conservatorship. Limited guardianship and guardianship are both court directed. They are both appointed by the court. They both require evidence that the person is unable, incapable of managing the issues for which guardianship is requested. The responsibilities are laid out by the court. In limited guardianship, those responsibilities are limited. So it might be the guardian may only have responsibility for healthcare, or the responsibility for deciding around where someone will live and what parts of their community they can engage in. The risk there is isolation. Remember, we talked about that earlier, that we want to be cautious that guardianship can potentially serve to isolate people. But the responsibilities and authority are laid out by the court. And guardians, as I believe I said earlier, have an ongoing relationship with the court. Guardianship is not simply the court waving a wand and saying, all right, you now have responsibility. You can make these decisions without any duty or duties required of the guardian. Guardians have to submit plans. They have to report back to the court and how the person is spending their time, how they're engaging with the person, how the person's finances are being administered. There is regular reporting that must occur with the court. But that takes us all the way to guardianship. So we really, if we're thinking about alternatives to guardianship, we really want to consider all the options before we get to guardianship. Some of the responsibilities of guardians. This information comes from the Oklahoma Bar Association Handbook for Guardians. Very helpful information if you're looking for details. These are not all of the duties and responsibilities, but some of them. The language says that guardians must ensure proper care and protection and safety, ensure health, support, and education. It doesn't say how. So there's lots of flexibility on how somebody can carry out their responsibilities as long as they are ensuring health, safety, care, protection. The person's property, their personal belongings, must be kept in good, personal, safe condition. Any duties that are assigned by the court in the guardianship proceedings must be carried out by the guardian. And guardians are required to do their best to ensure that the least restrictive, safest and ordinary housing and other opportunities are presented to the person. Guardians may not use the person's money for anyone other than the person, who in legal language is referred to as the ward, W-A-R-D. They may not sell the person's property, any belongings, without court approval. They may not move the person out of the county in which they live when guardianship is assigned without court approval. Guardians may not prohibit marriage or prohibit divorce without court approval. And they may not generally restrict the person more than necessary. That may be up for debate sometimes. There are certainly people we know who would like more opportunity than guardians may permit. We also know people, not an uncommon experience, I think, to spend time with people who have been assigned a guardian who are very, very capable. If you look to the national guardianship standards, one of the overriding expectations is that guardians will engage the person for whom they are a guardian in all decision making, that they will always consider the person's interests and desires and what matters to the person when making decisions for them. Oklahoma also recognizes something called conservatorship. And though this language is used in other states, sometimes it is synonymous with guardianship. In Oklahoma, conservatorship is specifically for people who live with a physical disability and a physical disability only. Conservatorship fits in a couple of places in some ways, if you will, on our continuum. It is a court-appointed process. So it is directed by the court. However, it does require voluntary consent. The person must agree, person living with a physical disability must agree to the appointment of their conservator. And the conservator is appointed by the court to preserve and protect the person's property, estate, belongings, if the person is unable to manage those parts of their life. Conservators may manage some finances. There are some restrictions on that, and the Oklahoma Bar Association Guardianship Handbook spells out those details pretty clearly. Technically, conservators have the same powers and duties as a guardian, but again, conservators are designated only for people living with a physical disability, and it requires consent. So the person must agree to having a conservator manage those parts of their life. So this wraps up our coverage of all the alternatives to guardianship. I'm going to walk back through this continuum one more time just to kind of touch each one of these to just kind of bring it all back together and remind us what those options are. So in the space where the person stays in charge, the person remains in charge, they are the decision maker. We have independent and collective decision making. And those are the spaces where somebody makes a decision completely on their own. Yes, this is what I'm wearing today. Yes, this is the bus I'm getting on to go to work today. Or they are engaging with others in their life to support them in making those decisions in a very informal manner. There isn't necessarily paperwork, there isn't any formal agreement. It is the kind of decision-making, that collective decision-making that most of us use in our own lives when we're trying to seek input and to seek guidance and to seek support in a decision as we're kind of walking through all of the pros and cons of that decision. More formally, there is supported decision-making. And supported decision-making, again, across the disability system has really, really gained traction as an alternative to guardianship. It is a legal agreement between others and the person, agreeing together to provide support and assistance with decision-making to the person when the person requests. And the person is identifying who they want to have help them with those decisions. So they may be deciding that somebody will help them with healthcare. They may be deciding that someone will help them with finances. They may be deciding that someone will help them with housing, etc. We talked about powers of attorney, healthcare powers of attorney, financial powers of attorney. Healthcare power of attorney is the person that is designated, and preferably there's a second person that is designated to make healthcare decisions when the individual is unable to do so, when they are considered incapacitated. Powers of attorney only go into effect when the person has been deemed incapacitated. Typically, that incapacity is determined by a clinician, and it is most often in a clinical setting where there's a healthcare decision to be made, and a physician says this person is incapable. They are incapacitated right now, and they are not able to make the healthcare decisions that are needed, that need to be made. Financial power of attorney, sometimes called a property power of attorney, is the person that, again, the individual designates to manage their financial affairs, assets, estate, belongings, finances, when that person is incapacitated. On that side, to the left of that green line, in that space, the person is in charge. The person decides who will help them and how they will help them. When we cross that line, we move into the space where the person is not in charge of who will help them. In healthcare decision-making, we then have the surrogate decision-making legislation. That's the legislation that says if there is not an identified healthcare power of attorney, if there is not a guardian in place, if there's not someone identified already to make a healthcare decision for the person, then the courts have laid out this list of who will make decisions. The healthcare system will look to a guardian. If there's not a guardian, they're going to ask if there's a healthcare power of attorney. If there is not a healthcare power of attorney, they're going to ask if there's a spouse. If there's not a spouse, they're going to see if they're going to see if there are adult children. If there are no adult children, they will look to parents, they will look to siblings, and the list goes on and on. That list, that surrogate decision-making list, is very important. It absolutely determines from the court's perspective, from a legal perspective, who can make healthcare decisions for someone. But it does remove that authority from the person. And so we want to try and stay on the left side of the continuum line so that the person stays in charge as much as they can all the way through the process. As you continue to move across that continuum beyond surrogate decision making, we have limited guardianship. Limited guardianship is really still an alternative to full guardianship because it means that the guardian who has limited powers, right, will only make certain decisions. And then we reach guardianship and conservatorship. So if you're thinking about literal alternatives to guardianship, we want to fully consider from a process standpoint, a very structured standpoint, we want to consider supported decision-making, engaging a supported decision-making team, enacting supported decision-making agreements. So it's very clear who will make what decisions and under what circumstances they'll make those decisions, and also identifying power of attorney. We want to make sure that the person has a relationship with that person, that power of attorney understands what that person's wishes would be, what their goals and values are in their life, so that if they are called upon to make a healthcare decision, that they feel capable of doing so. And those processes, the collective decision-making, but from a structured standpoint, structured supported decision-making and powers of attorney are the processes that help the person stay in charge, keep them as the authority in identifying who will make decisions for them before we cross that line into the system making decisions. Thank you so much for joining us. If you've got questions, you can reach out to the Oklahoma Developmental Disabilities Council. You can reach out to me. My email is on this slide. And we want to acknowledge that this project was funded by the Developmental Disabilities Council of Oklahoma and supported by funds from the Administration on Community Living.